At 3 a.m., the president of the HOA was ankle-deep in muddy water, screaming into her phone while her Lexus floated gently into a neighbor's garden. Sirens in the distance, sprinklers shorting out, fruit trees snapping in the current. And all I could think was, I warned them, but they had to dig that trench. They had to destroy my orchard. So I gave them exactly what they asked for and a little bit more. You're probably wondering how we got here. Well, let me take you back a few months to when everything was still green and peaceful literally. My backyard was my pride and joy. I lived just outside a neighborhood governed by an overachieving homeowners association. Thankfully, my little plot of heaven sits just beyond their reach, legally speaking. I built my home with a modest budget and an even more modest ego, nestled on a bit of unincorporated land that backed up to their fan cookie cutter paradise. And on that land, an orchard, pear trees, plums, figs, and a stubborn little apple tree that never quite caught on but still tried every season. That orchard wasn't just a hobby, it was therapy, it was legacy. It was apparently a visual disruption according to a woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex. Enter Dolores Dingle. Yes, her actual name. I know, it felt scripted. Dolores, president of the HOA, had a permanent squint, like she was constantly offended by sunlight and poor taste. She'd never formally introduced herself, but she had no problem slipping HOA newsletters into my mailbox, technically illegal, technically adorable most of the time. I ignored her, and she returned the favor, until the great puddle. A particularly rainy February had left a low-lying corner of their subdivision swimming. Now, anyone with eyes could see it was poor grading and a bad drainage slope in their own backyard desig. But instead of addressing their own engineering failure, the whole board, and by that I mean Dolores and her equally power-hungry sidekick, Gary from Lot 12, decided to blame me, or more specifically, my orchard's irrigation system. Apparently, the orchard was somehow responsible for increased groundwater retention, which translated into, there's a puddle in Susan's yard. I found out about this from a passive-aggressive email Dolores sent, not to me, but to the neighborhood Google group, with my address bolded in all caps, contributing non-compliant water flow source. I'm not making this up. Who talks like that? I laughed at first. Then came the trench. One morning, I walked out with my coffee and found a backhoe parked half on my property. Men in high-vis vests were digging a narrow trench along the shared property line. It ran right into the corner of my orchard, carving through roots like they were butter. I called out, furious. They shrugged, said they were hired by the HOA, something about improving runoff drainage. I told them to stop immediately. They didn't. 2 of my plum trees were practically sheared in half. A fig tree leaned like it had just been gut-punched. The soil carefully cultivated and tended over 5 years was disrupted like a war zone. I stormed over to Dolores' house, fists clenched, camera rolling on my phone. She opened the door with a practiced smirk and a glass of Chardonnay. I asked her politely at first why her contractors had trespassed and destroyed my property. She told me it was necessary maintenance for the benefit of the neighborhood. I asked her when I gave permission for a trench to run through my orchard. She said, "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just landscaping." I stood there, blinking. "You killed my figs for landscaping?" She sipped. "They're just trees." It was at that moment I knew 2 things. 1, Dolores had no soul. And 2, this was going to get ugly. I tried the legal route, first documented everything, took videos, called my insurance, hired a lawyer. He was polite, competent, and entirely unhelpful. Apparently, the trench was technically just outside the boundary where I could claim significant damages. It would cost me more to sue than I'd ever get back, and the HOA, surprise, surprise, had a legal team on retainer. So unless I wanted to spend the next 5 years in court arguing about root encroachment, I was out of luck. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't done. They started sending me notices claiming I was now directing water toward their neighborhood on purpose, that my irrigation setup, which had existed for half a decade without complaint, was suddenly a malicious water management system. Their words, malicious. Like I had some Bond villain lair pumping groundwater into their community for sport. They told me I had 30 days to remove my non-compliant irrigation structure. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. There's no irrigation structure, it's a hose, and gravity. Still, the damage to the orchard got worse. The trench, open and poorly reinforced, caused additional erosion during the next rainfall. 5 trees in total showed signs of stress. One of my pear trees collapsed entirely. After a particularly bad storm, when I showed up to an HOA meeting to confront them, they told me I was trespassing, that it was a members-only session. Dolores had security, yes, actual security, escort me off the property. Clipboard, smug glances, and all. At that point, something in me snapped, not in the lose my mind kind of way, but in the surgical, calculated kind. The kind of snap that says, fine, you want a flood, let's make it rain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You see, the final straw wasn't the trench or the death of my trees or even being accused of eco-terrorism via hosepipe. It was when I came home one afternoon and found a brand new concrete drainage pipe running through my back fence. Not next to, not along, through. Someone had cut through my fence, installed a pipe that ran straight into my orchard, and then sealed it like it had always been there. No note, no permission, no explanation. That night, I stood in the dark with a flashlight and stared at the pipe, just humming to myself like a villain at the top of Act 2. They thought they could funnel their water problem into my land like it was a natural trash can. They thought I'd just accept it like they'd claimed a new piece of territory. HOA. Manifest destiny, and that's when I decided they built the trench. They pointed the water at me. But what happens when the water changes direction? What happens when the orchard gives back? Let's just say physics is a beautiful thing. I spent the next week researching things I never thought I'd need to know, like municipal water flow codes, soil permeability rates, and how liability is determined when water mysteriously goes where it's not supposed to. It turns out there's a whole world of legal gray areas when it comes to runoff, and the deeper I dug, the more I realized just how much the HOA had overplayed their hand. The trench they'd carved through my orchard wasn't just rude. It was a clear violation of easement laws. Problem was proving that in court would cost more than my truck, and dragging it through the system would likely result in nothing but stress and years of my life lost to paperwork and petty countersuits. And knowing Dolores, she'd treat every court date like a fashion show. I called my lawyer again just to be sure I wasn't missing anything. He gave me the same shrug through the phone. Answer, technically you have a case, he said, chewing something loudly, but they'll just delay countersue and bury you in HOA bylaws. You'd be out 10 grand. Before they even blink, I thanked him and hung up, then looked out my window at the shattered remains of what used to be my best plum tree. That tree had given me fruit for 6 seasons. It was the first thing I'd planted after building the house. I remember tying little ribbons around its trunk to keep the rabbits from chewing the bark when it was still young. Now it looked like someone had blown out its root system with dynamite and left it to die. I tried reasoning again, because apparently I still had a scrap of optimism buried under all the sarcasm. I emailed the HOA with a formal complaint, complete with photos, a timeline of damage, and quotes from local contractors estimating the cost of repairs. The response, a form letter signed by Dolores, stating that the HOA was committed to commune excellence and would be investigating the matter internally. I could almost hear her smirking through the screen. 2 days later, a fresh notice was taped to my front door, literally taped like a teenager breaking up with you after prom. The notice accused me of violating water management ordinances and claimed my property was now the likely source of worsening flood risk in adjacent parcels. Translation, they destroyed my land, and now they were blaming me for the mess they created. That's when the pettiness began in earnest. HOA members I'd never even met started glaring. When they walked past my house, someone left a nasty handwritten note in my mailbox about selfish landowners ruining property values. One neighbor who used to wave every morning just turned and walked the other way. It was like being cast as the villain in a movie I had an audition for. I wouldn't have been surprised if Dolores had handed out pitchforks and torches at the next board meeting. They weren't done, of course. Dolores was just getting warmed up. One morning, I woke up to the sound of power tools and found a concrete drainage pipe being installed, this time without any subtlety at all. A hired crew, again under HOA orders, was now expanding their trench into a full-blown storm water solution, pouring concrete and rebar into a channel that now clearly crossed over into my land. I confronted the crew. They said they had permits. I asked to see them. They shrugged. One guy offered me a donut and told me he just did. What he was told, the real kicker, when I went to City Hall to raise hell, I was informed that the permit application had listed the area as community common space, which of course it wasn't. It was my land, but the application had been rubber stamped by someone who clearly didn't bother to check the actual parcel map. Bureaucracy, baby, got to love it. I filed a formal dispute that same day, but I knew it would be weeks before anyone even read it. By now the orchard was down nearly half its trees. The trench was eroding soil faster than I could stabilize it. Even the birds that used to perch on the fig branches in the morning seemed to have taken a hint and moved on. I felt like I was watching a part of my life being erased one tree at a time, and I was supposed to smile and nod while the HOA handed me the shovel. So I stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. I called up an old college buddy, Eli, civil engineer, dry sense of humor, and a knack for solving petty problems with elegant solutions. I explained everything to him, right down to the trench, the destroyed orchard, the concrete pipe, and Dolores' smug face. There was a long pause on the line before he said, if they're going to use gravity against you, there's no reason you can't return the favor. It was the most beautiful sentence I had heard in ages. Eli came by that weekend with a topographic survey map, a laser level, and a cooler full of beer. We walked the property for hours, checking slope angles, identifying choke points, and mapping where the trench entered and exited. Turns out their little drainage system only worked as long as my land absorbed the overflow. It had never been designed to function if the water had nowhere to go, or worse, if it had a path back. That was when Operation Reverse Flood was born. I didn't need to destroy anything. I didn't need to break a single law. All I had to do was make sure the water they pushed onto my land found its way back to them. With just a little encouragement, Eli helped me design a covert French drain system. Think of it like an underground slip and slide for water. I laid it all out myself, a little bit each day, no permits needed. Because I wasn't building a structure, I was just improving my landscape. That's what the city paperwork would say anyway. I replaced the soft topsoil along the trench with packed clay and gravel, making it harder for water to soak in. I planted hardy, deep-rooted shrubs along the boundaries, ones that subtly redirected flow. And beneath it all, I buried the piping, connected strategically to ensure any overflow from their trench would travel right back downhill, straight into the lowest points of their properties. I spent 2 weeks working on it quietly, sometimes at night with a headlamp. No one suspected a thing. The HOA assumed they'd broken me. Then I'd just slink off into defeat and replant my garden like a good little peasant. But I wasn't replanting. I was rearming. The irony was perfect. All I had to do was let nature do what it always does, seek balance. Water flows downhill. Always. I just made sure that when the next big storm hit, it would flow back the way it came. And when it did, oh, you better believe it hit hard. But that's not even the best part, because just 3 days before the storm, Dolores sent me a certified letter, a final warning, she called it, demanding that I take immediate action to cease all disruptive landscaping activities. It ended with one sentence underlined and bold. You are responsible for any damages caused by your actions. I read it. I laughed, and I thought, oh, Dolores, you have no idea what's coming. The sky turned that thick slate gray that makes everyone instinctively check their weather apps. Even though they already know what it means, a big one was coming. The forecasts were all variations of the same headline: significant rainfall expected. Risk of flash flooding in low-lying areas? I smiled when I read it, not because I like disasters. I'm not a monster, but because for once, the natural order was about to correct itself. And I didn't have to lift a single illegal finger. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the storm had perfect timing. By this point, the HOA had fully completed their trench monstrosity, a concrete storm drain now snaked along the side of their subdivision, with the outflow sloping conveniently into the lower corner of my land. My orchards form a resting place, now a mangled mud patch with a pipe sticking out like a weaponized straw. Their new system was ugly, over-engineered, and very, very vulnerable. It only worked because they assumed I would keep being their sponge. that my land would soak up their runoff like a good little buffer zone, that I'd stay passive, quiet, compliant. They never realized that nature has a sense of humor, and sometimes, so do I. The rain started light, a polite drizzle, the kind that smells nice and makes everything look freshly rinsed. But by evening, it was hammering down like a percussion section on espresso. I watched from my back porch, coffee in hand. As the first sheets of water pulled in the train, it filled fast, much faster than I'd expected, which was saying something considering I had personally helped design the sabotage them. Problem was they never addressed the core issue. The land in that corner was too flat. Without somewhere to drain to, the water just sat there backing up, getting heavier, rising, and my little drainage system beneath the surface. Oh, it was doing its job beautifully, quietly redirecting all that lovely HOA runoff right back into their backyard. By midnight, the trench had become a canal. Water sloshed over the concrete edges, pushing mud and debris into their neatly mulched flower beds. One poor guy's patio furniture had started to drift slightly, like a lazy pool float. I saw someone running around in a raincoat with a flashlight, waving their arms at the rising water like they could shame it into going away. I almost felt bad, almost at around 1 o'clock, and I spotted Dolores standing on her porch in a bathrobe, holding a phone in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other. Her hair was sticking to her face in wet clumps, and she kept looking toward my property, like she could will the water to stop. By sheer force of judgment, I turned off my porch light. No need to glow just yet. Besides, the show wasn't over. Then came the failure point. The HOA, in their infinite wisdom, had tried to install a catch basin at the lowest part of their common area, just a big fancy hole with a metal grate to collect overflow. The problem, it wasn't deep enough, and the grate was already clogged with leaves and mulch from the landscaping. Dolores insisted on having refreshed every 2 weeks. I watched as the water buildup crept over the basin, and then with a quiet, almost polite gurgle, spilled over into the main street of the neighborhood. The current picked up fast. Sidewalks disappeared, driveways vanished, a mailbox tilted at a weird angle and just gave up, snapping off at the base. At 3 a.m., the sirens arrived, a fire truck to squad cars, and a city maintenance vehicle rolled in like the cavalry arriving just after the battle is lost. They parked near the front of the subdivision where the flooding hadn't quite reached, and the emergency lights reflected off the shimmering lake. That used to be the HOA's manicured cul-de-sac. I could hear the radios crackling from my porch. Dolores, meanwhile, was yelling into her phone, standing in ankle-deep water, while her silver Lexus gently floated down the slope of her driveway like it was part of a luxury boat parade. I couldn't hear her words, but her body language was clear: blame, rage, disbelief. I imagined she was trying to reach the city, the fire department, maybe even her lawyer, one who would listen. But there was nothing they could do in that moment. The water was already there, the damage had been done, and all of it had originated from the very system she forced into existence. Across the street, someone's garden gnome sailed by like a tiny judgmental raft. It was surreal. When the sun finally rose a few hours later, the neighborhood looked like it had hosted an impromptu. Riata lawns were destroyed, mulch had mutated into bizarre swirling piles. Basements were soaked, and the HO's precious walking path gone, submerged under 6 inches of gritty debris. Filled runoff. City engineers showed up later that morning to assess the situation. I played the concerned neighbor role, perfectly, standing just far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to overhear the growing panic. I brought out a thermos of coffee and offered some to one of the city workers. He accepted it gratefully, then pointed to the trench and muttered, "Whose idea was this disaster?" I kept a straight face and said I think it was an HOA initiative. Something about redirecting excess runoff from their common areas. He nodded grimly. Well, it redirected all right. By noon, a dozen homeowners were clustered around Dolores' house, wet shoes and angry expressions. Some were waving phones. Others had papers. A few were clearly crying. Dolores herself looked like she hadn't slept. Her robe was gone, replaced by a stiff blazer that she clearly thought would project authority, but only made her look more out of touch. I stayed quiet on my porch, trimming what was left of my remaining fig tree, casually listening. Voices carried in that open neighborhood design they loved so much. Accusations flew. "Why didn't you Test the system who approved this. What do you mean insurance won't cover it? Someone shouted about suing. Another demanded a special meeting. Dolores tried to maintain control, raising her hands and calling for calm. No one was interested in calm. The community had turned. Her kingdom was drowning, and the peasants were sharpening pitchforks. That night I opened the certified letter she had sent just days before, the one where she told me I'd be responsible for damages. I read it again just for fun, then slid it into a folder labeled evidence just in case. But honestly, I wasn't worried because legally I'd done nothing wrong. I hadn't diverted anything. I hadn't altered city infrastructure. All I did was adjust my own landscaping, and if their trench couldn't handle nature doing what nature does well, that sounded like a design flaw to me. What made it even sweeter was that they didn't even know I was behind it yet. To them, the flooding was just an unlucky combination of heavy rain and poor engineering. And maybe that's all it would ever be, at least on paper, but I knew, and that was enough. Well, almost enough, because the next morning, someone slid a letter under my door. No envelope, just a single, neatly typed sheet of paper. It was from Dolores, and it began with 5 words: "We need to talk urgently." I stared at the letter on my kitchen counter for a solid 10 minutes, sipping lukewarm coffee and wondering what shade of panic Dolores' voice would carry when I finally decided to entertain her plea. We need to talk urgently, 5 words that tasted like surrender with a hint of desperation. It was the HOA equivalent of a white flag, typed, printed, and hand-delivered under the cover of soggy dawn. I wasn't exactly in a forgiving mood, but curiosity is a stubborn thing, and besides, I wanted to see how she was going to spin this mess. It was the first time in months she wasn't holding all the cards. I walked down to her place that afternoon, deliberately choosing the most casual clothes. I owned mud-stained jeans, a wrinkled shirt, and my favorite straw hat, the one she once passive-aggressively referred to as very farmer core. Her driveway was a disaster. The Lexus had been towed the night before, but the waterline stain on her garage door was still visible, a brown stripe marking just how high the water had risen. Her front yard looked like a compost heap that had lost a fight with a leaf blower. The soggy home newsletter lay stuck to her porch like a badge of shame. She opened the door looking like she hadn't slept in a year, hair pulled back, eyes sunken, blazer replaced by a damp hoodie that said "Property Value Matters." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. "Thank you for coming," she said, like she was hosting a brunch and not the aftermath of her own downfall. "I was in the neighborhood," I replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The living room was sterile, painfully beige, and smelled faintly of lemon-scented anxiety. She motioned to the couch. I didn't sit. She cut to the chase. "We need to discuss what happened, the flooding, the damage." "Oh, the flood," I said, feigning surprise. "Yes. That was quite the biblical event. So strange how water behaves when forced through untested systems." Her jaw tightened. "We believe there was interference." "Interference," I echoed, nodding from who she hesitated. That was the moment I saw it. She didn't have proof, just suspicion. A vague paranoid certainty that I had somehow orchestrated this, but nothing she could actually hold up in court or even in a community meeting without looking unhinged. "I know what you did," she said finally, voice low. I smiled. "And yet here I am, not rested, not sued, just a humble landowner with some very wet, very damaged trees." She stared at me, trying to regain control of the conversation. "This is a crisis. Dozens of homes were affected. Insurance claims are being denied. The board is in chaos." "Sounds like poor planning," I said, shrugging. "Maybe the person responsible should be held accountable." That hit home. Her face flickered. "They're calling for a special election. I might be removed as president." Tragic. She leaned forward, abandoning all pretense. "Look, this doesn't help anyone. You've made your point. All right, the trench, the pipe, we went too far, but now the entire neighborhood is suffering, and we're all neighbors, aren't we?" It was almost impressive the way she could flip the script so effortlessly. The woman who trespassed, destroyed my property, and tried to bury me in bureaucratic nonsense was now trying to sell me unity and togetherness, like we were in this mess together. Just two folks caught in a little community squabble. I wasn't buying it. "You want something from me," I said. "What is it?" She paused, calculating. "We need help. The city is demanding we correct the drainage issue immediately. They've issued a violation notice and threatened fines. We need access to your land to reroute the trench, and your cooperation would help ease tensions." I looked at her for a long moment. She wanted me to bail her out. She wanted me to undo the very consequences she created, not because she felt guilty, not because she'd learned anything, but because the flood had finally reached her doorstep, literally and figuratively. I'll think about it, I said, turning to leave. That's it, she called after me. I turned back. You know, Beatrice, you really should have left the orchard alone. Back home, I opened my laptop and began documenting everything: photos, videos, copies of every notice they'd ever taped to my door. I uploaded it all into a neat little file called HOA. I didn't think it would come to that. Beatrice's power was slipping faster than floodwater down a hill. Over the next week, the HOA unraveled. A handful of residents formally filed motions to dissolve the current board. Someone spray-painted "Drain Queen" on Beatrice's garage door. Another homeowner emailed the entire neighborhood with a copy of the original trench plan and a scathing breakdown of how the HOA had ignored multiple engineering warnings. The insurance company began denying claims on the grounds of gross negligence, which only added fuel to the mutiny. Beatrice tried to call another emergency meeting, but barely anyone showed up. One by one, board members resigned. Beatrice held out the longest, clinging to her title like it could float, but eventually even she had to concede. The resignation letter was defensive and riddled with legal but it ended with the one sentence everyone wanted to read: effective immediately. I resigned as president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. I printed it, framed it, hung it in my tool shed next to a plaque that said, "Don't start none. Won't be none." The aftermath was messy but delicious. The HOA was forced to hire an independent contractor to redesign the entire drainage system. This time with real permits, actual surveys, and city supervision. They paid for everything out of their emergency fund, which promptly emptied. Dues were temporarily doubled, and that went over about as well as you'd expect. Beatrice moved out a few months later, sold her house at a loss. Word was she went to live in a gated community on the other side of town. I wished them luck. As for me, I started replanting, not because I'd forgiven or forgotten, but because it was time. The land deserved better. I brought in new soil, replaced the fallen trees, and even installed a small greenhouse paid for ironically with the settlement check I finally wrangled out of the city once they admitted their oversight in approving the original trench plan. The orchard came back slowly, but it came back stronger. The birds returned. The bees returned. One afternoon, while harvesting my first batch of pears from the new trees, a kid from down the street rode by on his bike and called out, "Hey, you're the guy who flooded the HOA, right?" I looked at him and grinned. I prefer neighborhood hydrologist, but sure, he laughed and pedaled off, and I stood there holding a pear, thinking about how ridiculous and beautiful it all was. They had called my orchard a problem, a nuisance, an eyesore. Funny thing about nature, it always finds balance, just like water, just like karma.